Islam, Authoritarianism, and Underdevelopment. AHMETT. KURU Part 2 History. 7 Collapse. Western colonialism and Muslim reformists. 18th to 19th centuries. During and after the failed siege of Vienna in 1683, the Ottomans suffered defeats by multiple European forces. With the Treaty of Karlowitz, 1699, the empire lost substantial territories in Eastern Europe. In the first half of the 18th century, the Ottomans gained back some of these territories from Austria, Russia, and Venice, but during the second half of the 18th century, they were repeatedly vanquished by Russia. With the Treaty of Kukuk-Kainarka in 1774, the Ottoman Empire gave up Crimea, which made its subsequent occupation by Russia possible. With the treaty, Russia also gained protector status over Orthodox Christian subjects of the Ottoman Empire. Following Napoleon's invasion of Egypt, 1798 to 1801, it became increasingly important for the Ottoman Empire to ally with some European powers against others. After the Ottoman army's successive defeats by Mehmed Ali's Egyptian troops in the 1830s, the very survival of the empire hinged in large part on the balance of power in Europe. A loss of economic sovereignty followed military failure. The 1838 Treaty of Balta-Limani, also known as the Anglo-Ottoman Treaty, provided certain advantages for British exports to the Ottoman Empire. According to Pamuk, it was no longer possible for the weak Ottoman Empire to reject the demands of Britain and other European powers. Nearly 3 decades later, the empire was even forced to accept the foreigners' rights to purchase agricultural land and the foreign-owned Ottoman bank's monopoly to print paper currency in its territory. The capitulations the Ottoman Empire had previously signed with European countries also facilitated European domination of its economy. Moreover, as Turan Kağıtlı points out, European states' extraterritorial jurisdiction in the Ottoman Empire's territory increasingly violated its sovereignty. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, Safavid Iran also experienced socio-economic crises, as well as military challenges from the Ottomans, Mughals, Russians, Uzbeks, and Afghans, leading to its demise. Following the end of the Safavid rule, Nader Shah, r. 1736–47, a military mastermind from a different tribe, emerged as the ruler of Iran. He expanded Iranian territories at the expense of its neighbors. After Nader's death, however, his empire was partitioned into smaller, rival polities. Later, in 1794, the Qajar dynasty unified Iran again and managed to rule it, albeit with a weak state, until 1925. In a similar vein, the Mughal Empire began to break down during and after the reign of its last great emperor, Aurangzeb, d. 1707. Some reasons for its decline included extravagant spending, intolerant policies against the Hindu majority, Hindu revolts and secessions by the Rajputs and the Marathas, Iranian invasions led by Nader Shah, and Afghan raids led by Ahmad Shah Durrani. Around 1764, the British East India Company colonized Bengal and subsequently other parts of India. Following the unsuccessful Indian Mutiny in 1857, the British Empire established direct colonial rule in India and formally terminated the, already merely symbolic, Mughal dynasty. European colonization of Ottoman lands began with the French occupation of Algiers in 1830. Half a century later, France brought Tunisia under its colonial rule, which by then extended over almost all of West Africa, mostly populated by Muslims. In 1869, the Suez Canal was opened as a French-Egyptian enterprise. A few years later, Britain bought the Egyptian shares in the canal. In 1882, Britain's gradual occupation of Egypt began. British colonization was also extended to Sudan and the Gulf. Iran was never directly colonized. Nonetheless, in the early 20th century it was divided between British and Russian zones of influence. Russia at that time had already colonized several Muslim populations living in the Eurasian steppe, Central Asia, and the Caucasus, see Map 5. By the end of World War I, the entire Middle East was under direct or indirect control by Britain and France. Following the armistice in 1918, British, French, and Italian troops entered Istanbul. 2 years later, Britain and its allies arrested Ottoman parliamentarians and occupied various official posts in the city. With these developments, the Ottoman Sultan, who also claimed to be the Caliph of Muslims, became a hostage, and for the second time in history, following the Mongol invasion of Baghdad, the heart of the caliphate was in the hands of non-Muslim forces. The unprecedented extent of European colonization of the Muslim world, far surpassing the conquests of the Mongols and Crusaders in earlier centuries, depended on but was not limited to military force. Europeans also dominated through educational institutions, scientific knowledge, technology, and economic organizations. How did Europeans become so advanced and overtake Muslims on so many fronts? In this chapter, I will explore how Muslim rulers and intellectuals confronted and debated this question. Printing presses and Quran translations. During the political crises in various Muslim countries, the ulama kept, if not strengthened, their influential position. Toward the end of the Safavid Empire, the higher-ranking ulama increased their political power. Muhammad Baqir Majlisi, the Sheikh al-Islam of the capital Isfahan from 1687 to 1699, was a powerful player in Safavid politics. He organized persecution campaigns against Sufis and religious minorities. 10 Similarly, the Ottoman ulama became so powerful in the 18th century that they established a sort of aristocracy, with certain degrees and offices increasingly assigned to the sons of prominent ulama. The main source of the ulama's legitimacy was its monopoly over interpreting Islam, which they maintained through their control of madrasas. Printing presses could threaten this monopoly, therefore, the ulama opposed their establishment. Not a single book was printed by Muslims from 1455, when the first European book was printed, to 1729, when the first Ottoman book was printed. The ulama also opposed the translation of the Quran into vernacular languages. This opposition resulted in an extremely low, around 1% in 1800, literacy rate in Ottoman society, whereas Western European countries attained much higher average literacy rates, 31% by 1800, thanks in part to the establishment of printing presses, access to the vernacular Bible and other texts, and diverse educational institutions. Nearly half a century after Gutenberg, the Jewish minority in Istanbul established the first printing press in Ottoman lands in order to print Hebrew texts. It would take 2 more centuries for a printing press to be established by Ottoman Muslims. It has been argued that there were 80 to 90,000 copyists in 17th century Istanbul, and they formed a powerful bloc in opposition to the printing press due to the economic threat it posed to them. Considering the estimated population of Istanbul at the time was around 700,000, this number is obviously misleading. But even if there had been strong scribal opposition to the printing press, it could not have delayed the establishment of presses for centuries. In the 15th century Paris, the scribe guild strongly opposed the printing press, but succeeded in delaying the introduction of printing only 20 years. Another explanation is that the Arabic alphabet was simply more difficult to render into standardized type than the Latin alphabet. In the Arabic alphabet, each letter has different forms and linkages to other letters, depending on whether it is in the beginning, middle, or end of the word. But this explanation for delayed Ottoman adoption of the printing press is not persuasive either. The difficulty of converting Arabic letters to set type did not prevent European publishers from printing books with Arabic script. Between the 16th and 18th centuries, European presses printed various titles in Arabic, and some in Persian and Turkish, including the Quran, the Bible, books by early Muslim philosophers, and grammars, and exported some of them to the Ottoman Empire. The real reason for the Ottomans' delay in establishing a printing press was the ulama's opposition, which was rooted in their desire to preserve their monopoly over education and scholarship. Unlike Western European states, the Ottoman Empire did not have an influential merchant class who could profit from printing and therefore supported the establishment of printing presses. Anderson makes a similar argument about China. Although printing was invented first in China, possibly 500 years before its appearance in Europe, it had no major, let alone revolutionary impact, precisely because of the absence of capitalism there. The Sultan and officials were the only group in the Ottoman Empire that could lift the barriers put in place by the ulama. Following a series of wars with Austria and Venice, the Ottomans enjoyed a decade of peace in the 1720s. The Grand Vizier at the time, Ibrahim Pasha, inaugurated the so-called Tulip period, which witnessed artistic flourishing and early efforts at westernization. Ibrahim Pasha patronized the establishment of the first printing press for Muslims in Istanbul. The Ottoman emissary to France, Mem Chalebi, was also a key supporter of the press. His son, who would later become Grand Vizier, collaborated with Ibrahim Mutafarrika, a Hungarian convert and diplomat, on this initiative. In 1727, the printing of non-religious books was permitted by a decree of the Sultan and a supportive fatwa of the Sheikh al-Islam. In his petition to Ottoman authorities, Mutafarrika explained the necessity of the printing press with reference to several reasons, which can be summarized in three main points. First, book writing and reading were in a bad shape in the Muslim world. This was a legacy of the Mongol invasion of Asia and the Iberian Catholics' invasion of Andalus, both of which destroyed many Muslim books. Second, compared with writing manuscripts, printing books would be less expensive, have longer-lasting ink, and entail fewer errors in copying the text. Third, printed books would have novel features such as indexes and tables of contents. Mutafarrika's press in Istanbul started printing books in 1729. By 1745, it had printed 17 titles and an estimated 12,000 books. From 1746 to 1802, Ottoman presses printed 28 other titles. Hence, the total number of books they printed in the 18th century can be estimated to be less than 50,000. By contrast, in the same century, nearly 1 billion books were produced in Europe. Between 1803 and 1875, the number of titles printed in Ottoman presses increased but remained relatively low, 2,855. There were two major reasons for the limited impact of Ottoman presses in their first 150 years. One was the absence of a dynamic bourgeoisie who could have used the presses effectively. The other was the lack of a vibrant intellectual atmosphere with a demand for new books by a large number of readers. The case of Mutafarrika illustrates both factors. Professionally, Mutafarrika continued to work as a diplomat, so he could not focus on printing and selling books, as a merchant might do. Intellectually, Mutafarrika had sufficient qualifications, a polymath. He updated and printed important books on geography, history, and languages. Nonetheless, the Ottoman state did not sufficiently appreciate his intellectual contributions and did not let him focus on his publications. Instead, the state kept using Mutafarrika as a diplomat traveling long distances, as far as Poland, which resulted in long hiatuses and inefficiencies in his publication process. Muslim-run presses were established even later in other parts of the Muslim world, 1817 in Iran, Tabriz, 1819 in India, Lucknow, 1821 in Egypt, Cairo, 1844 in Russia, Kazan, lithographic, and 1853 in Indonesia, Surabaya, lithographic. In Central Asia, which was once a brilliant center of scholarship, no printing press existed until the Russian invasion, which began in 1864. The belated establishment of printing presses in Muslim societies was associated with their illiteracy problem. It also led to a reversal between Muslims and Western Europeans in terms of the sizes of their library collections. In early Islamic history, there were far more books in Muslim libraries than Western European ones, see Chapter 4. In the late 19th century, however, data for the Ottoman Empire and France indicate the opposite. According to the first Ottoman Statistical Yearbook, written in 1897, there were 324 public libraries with the total of only 193,000 books, 74,000 manuscripts, 49,000 printed books, and the rest unspecified. By contrast, in France, the country with the largest library collection in Europe, there were 7,298,000 books in 505 libraries in 1880. Another associated problem was the delayed mass production of Quran translations, which left Muslims who did not read classical Arabic entirely dependent on the ulama for understanding their religion. In fact, early Muslims were very open to the idea of translating the Quran. Abu Hanifa, d. 767, is reported to have permitted recitation of a Persian translation of the Quran in daily prayers, regardless of whether the person had mastered Arabic. The oldest extant Persian translation of the Quran was written in the 10th century in the interlinear form, between the lines of the Arabic text, as part of the Persian translation of Tabari's Arabic exegesis. Surviving Eastern Turkish and Anatolian Turkish translations of the Quran were also interlinear and written in the 14th and 15th centuries, although a reported, non-extant, translation is dated as early as the 10th century. In the 1730s, Shah Wali Allah, a leading Islamic scholar in India, wrote a Persian interlinear translation in Delhi. At that time, conservative Muslims' resistance to translating the Quran was so deep that even Wali Allah, despite his scholarly reputation, faced opposition. In the case of Europe, the mass dissemination of Bible translations was made possible by the printing press. In the Muslim world, the late adoption of the press delayed the wide circulation of Quran translations. Wali Allah's translation was finally printed in 1866. The Ottoman ulama put extra barriers against the publication of a Turkish translation of the Quran. First, they prohibited the printing of Islamic books until 1803. Next, they blocked the printing of the Quran until 1873. Finally, they prevented the printing of a complete Turkish translation of the Quran until the demise of the empire. Brett Wilson has examined an important effort in 1898 to work around the Ottoman ulama's barriers to printing a Turkish translation of the Quran. Semseddin Sami, 1850–1904, an Ottoman intellectual who compiled the first modern Turkish dictionary, wrote a Quranic translation in Turkish. He submitted the manuscript to the Ministry of Education for approval. The ministry sent it to the Sheikh al-Islam, whose approval was required for the publication of Islamic books. Sheikh al-Islam Mehmet Simoleddin replied that Sami's work translated the verses in a way that contradicted the explanations and interpretations of the great Quranic commentators and could never be published. The manuscript was eventually either destroyed or lost. Moreover, Sami faced public censure and, possibly, some type of punishment for translating the Quran into Turkish. Because of the ulama's opposition, the printing of the first complete Turkish translation of the Quran became possible only in 1924, a year after the foundation of the Turkish Republic. Although the late Ottoman ulama were still influential enough to prevent the translation of the Quran into Turkish, the Ulamad-State alliance was experiencing a profound crisis due to its failure to address Western challenges. The next section will explore these challenges. Western dominance. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the Netherlands' position in the world economy and politics declined, while Britain gained the leading position. Britain's preeminence was associated with its pioneering role in the Industrial Revolution. British inventors of such important technologies as the steam engine and textile machine were private entrepreneurs rather than governmental agents. These private inventions were combined with the British state's transportation and communication infrastructure, including the railroads, in addition to its usage of military and political power to exploit other countries' economic resources. As a result of this collaboration of private entrepreneurship and state power, Britain surpassed its competitors on the European continent and around the globe. Additionally, Britain played a leading role in the spread of scientific societies. Together with the Paris Academy of Sciences, established in 1666, the Royal Society, which was founded in London in 1660, became a model for subsequent academic societies, including the Berlin Academy of Sciences, established in 1700. Between 1701 and 1793, 70 official and 40 private scientific societies were established, all in Western Europe, except 6 in the United States and 1 in Russia. British philosophers joined with their French, Dutch, and German counterparts in contributing to the intellectual movement known as the Enlightenment. These philosophers transformed European political thought. Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau wrote on the state of nature and the theory of the social contract. Locke promoted limited government and religious toleration. Montesquieu elaborated the separation of powers. Smith articulated the dynamics of the market economy. These ideas influenced leaders of the American, 1775–83, and French, 1789, revolutions. In the American case, the bourgeoisie and intellectuals led the revolt against the British Crown and designed the newly independent United States. They did not attack the clergy, except the Anglican Church, because other churches were independent from the British monarchy. In the French Revolution, however, the bourgeoisie and intellectuals jointly attacked both the aristocracy and its main ally, the Catholic clergy. The United States became a model for many countries in terms of constitutionalism, religion-state separation, and democracy, while post-revolutionary France became a model for republicanism and nationalism throughout Europe and other parts of the world. In sum, the intellectuals and bourgeoisie played leading roles in such complex processes as the Enlightenment, the American and French revolutions, and the Industrial Revolution, which transformed Western European and North American, that is, Western, societies and polities. These processes contributed to Western countries' intellectual vibrancy, political participation, economic strength, and military power. By contrast, Muslim countries lacked such dynamic intellectuals and merchants. They did not experience philosophical, political, or technological revolutions. Hence, they became politically and militarily weaker than their Western counterparts. Western countries used their power to directly or indirectly colonize most parts of the world, including Muslim lands. Russia, starting in the 1690s, and Japan, starting in 1868, followed Western models and adopted certain Western institutions by state-led reforms. Like Western countries, they established colonial empires to exploit their neighbors' resources. A major criticism I received while writing this book is that by emphasizing progressive aspects of the rise of the West, I might downplay the violence and destruction Western colonialism has entailed. I acknowledge that Western, Russian, and Japanese colonialisms were based on coercive domination and had negative consequences for colonized societies. Although they made some positive contributions, such as building transportation and communication infrastructure, colonizers generally damaged local institutions and promoted internal divisions in colonized societies. Besides colonization, slavery was also an important component of Western economic development, from plantations in British West Indies to those in the southern United States. Western industrialization was also associated with the exploitation of the working class, including child labor. British colonialism was destructive for many parts of the Muslim world. It led to multiple disasters, such as the 1770 famine in Bengal. British colonialism also caused the deindustrialization of India, turning that country into an exporter of raw materials and an importer of British textiles. Britain's forced sale of opium in China made millions of Chinese addicted. In general, French colonialism in Muslim lands was more culturally assimilationist than British colonialism. The nature of Russian colonialism varied. In some periods, it was more culturally assimilationist toward Muslims than even French colonialism. Russia also pursued ethnic cleansing, in particular against Crimean Tatars and certain Caucasian Muslims. I have two main reasons for not focusing on these aspects of the rise of the West in my analysis. First, the history of Muslim societies also included occupation, exploitation, assimilation, slavery, and ethnic cleansing, for example, the late Ottoman Empire against Armenians. I do not elaborate them because it is very difficult to make a comparative analysis of the general human problem of violence, as I emphasized in Chapter 1. Second, this book is concerned with what made Western Europe once a marginal corner of the world so powerful that it could directly or indirectly colonize almost the entire rest of the world. Hence, colonialism can be only a part of my much broader analysis. When European countries colonized various territories of the Ottoman Empire, their domination was not simply based on military power. Instead, it had political, economic, and ideological dimensions. In the second half of the 18th century, the Ottomans suffered major defeats against Russia, which was supported by Austria and Britain. From a military point of view, these losses indicated that European military organization, training, tactical notions, and weaponry had surpassed those of Ottomans. From an economic perspective, these losses resulted from the expanding revenues of Russia and other European powers, which were increasingly able to invest in their militaries. Around the year 1900, according to the estimates of Eric Zurcher, the Ottoman state's income, 330 million Dutch guilders, was much smaller than those of Russia, 2,113 million, France, 1,831 million, Britain, 1,680 million, and Austria-Hungary, 1,321 million. Russia's large population also gave it a military advantage over the Ottomans. The estimated population of the Ottoman Empire was 26 million in 1800, it reached its zenith with 40 million in 1867, and it declined to 21 million in 1914, as a result of the Ottomans' low fertility rate and shrunken territory, reduced by half. The population of the Russian Empire, by contrast, increased from 28 million in 1783 to 60 million in 1835 and 161 million in 1913 due to both its high fertility rate and territorial expansion. Zurcher explains Ottoman military defeats by Russia in the late 19th century as a function of the increasing socio-economic gap between the two empires, in a struggle with a country like Russia, which was 7 times as rich, 5 times as populous, produced almost 30 times as much coal and had 11 times as big a rail network. Who should be surprised at the outcome? The socio-economic, political, and military challenges facing the Ottomans continued until the empire's demise. An important subset of Ottoman officials recognized these problems and tried to solve them through westernization reforms in the 19th century. At that time, Egypt became semi-independent and pursued its own westernization reforms. Related to these state-led efforts, reformist intellectuals across the Muslim world debated the proper course of action. Westernization reforms and reformist intellectuals. In the late 18th century, the earliest Ottoman westernization reforms introduced new educational institutes to address what was seen as the existential threat to the empire, its declining military capacity. The Janissaries were so opposed to military reform that they revolted and imprisoned the reformist Sultan, Selim III. The new Sultan, Mahmud II, r. 1808–39, waited until conditions were more favorable to implement reform. In 1826 the Janissaries revolted against Mahmud's initiative to modernize the army, but they failed to gain the support of other army units or the people of Istanbul. Troops loyal to Mahmud shelled the Janissaries' barracks with artillery, killing thousands. Mahmud abolished the institution of the Janissary Corps altogether. As a result, the ulama, who had so effectively opposed earlier reforming sultans through their coalition with the Janissaries, had now lost their strong arm. By abolishing the Janissaries and sidelining the ulama, Mahmud and his court bureaucrats gained the control they needed to modernize the Ottoman state. They started the reforms by opening Western-style military colleges. Westernization of the Ottoman military implied that the traditional links between the military and the religious institutions had been broken decisively. In 1839, right after the death of Mahmud, the new sultan and the bureaucrats issued the Tanzimat Edict, which guaranteed the protection of all Ottoman subjects' life, honor, and property. The edict set in motion a series of restoration policies, the so-called Tanzimat reforms. In 1844, a legal change abrogated capital punishment for apostasy from Islam. In 1856, the Islahat Edict promised full equality and religious liberty to non-Muslim citizens, in an effort to remove the protection of Christian minorities as a pretext for European powers' intervention in Ottoman domestic affairs. During this reform process, bureaucrats took over certain public positions previously held by the ulama. Developments in the education sector clearly reflected the downgrading of the ulama. The madrasas were so outdated and confined to religious studies that Ottoman reformers opted to establish entirely new colleges and schools based on Western models and specializing in such issues as the military, governance, diplomacy, medicine, and engineering. The ulama were still in charge of madrasas and some neighborhood schools, but they lost the monopoly over education. French became a language of instruction in some Ottoman colleges and schools, which trained officers and civilian bureaucrats. Translations of books written in European languages also sharply increased. With the emergence of Western-style commercial courts and laws, the ulama's judicial and legislative functions were also restricted. The bureaucrats wanted to adopt French commercial and civil codes, while the ulama aimed to codify Islamic law for both realms. In an imperial council meeting, the Grand Vizier Mustafa Rashid Pasha, who served intermittently between 1846 and 1858, said that Sharia had nothing to do with the legal reforms. The ulama present accused him of apostasy, and he was temporarily removed from office by the Sultan. Nonetheless, he returned to office and succeeded in having an adaptation of French commercial code promulgated in 1850. Egypt also pursued its own westernization reforms. Mehmed Mohammed Ali Pasha, an Ottoman officer of Albanian origin, was sent to Egypt right after Napoleon's invasion. A few years later, in 1805, he became governor of Egypt. In 1811, Mehmed Ali invited Mamluk commanders to a celebration in his citadel in Cairo and had them killed. He then ordered his army to destroy the remaining Mamluks, thus eradicating this centuries-old institution. Mehmed Ali also weakened the ulama by confiscating landed property of the foundations, which supported Al-Azhar and other mosques and madrasas. Having eliminated old power holders, Mehmed Ali implemented westernization reforms for the military, bureaucracy, taxation, medicine, and schooling. He sent students to European countries for education. Taking advantage of Ottoman military weakness following the abolishment of the Janissaries, Mehmed Ali attacked Syria and then Anatolia. He defeated Ottoman troops, but European powers intervened to halt his conquest. In 1841, Mehmed Ali withdrew from Syria and Anatolia in exchange for the international recognition of his hereditary rule in Egypt as semi-independent from the Ottoman Empire. Westernizing reforms led to the emergence of a class of Western-educated intellectuals in both the Ottoman Empire and Egypt. Rifat al-Tadawi, 1801–73, was one of the students the Egyptian government sent to Paris for education. On his return to Cairo, he became the director of the language school and coordinated the translation of numerous works. He supervised the translation of nearly 2,000 texts from French, other European languages, and Turkish into Arabic. In the Ottoman Empire, a group of young intellectuals and bureaucrats known as the Young Ottomans tried to synthesize Western and Islamic concepts to reform socio-political life. One of their well-known members was Namik Kemal, 1840–88, who promoted such notions as motherland and freedom. Zia Pasha, c. 1829–80, expressed young Ottoman views through poetry. In one of his famous poems, Zia Pasha acknowledged the gap between Western and Muslim levels of urban development. I traveled through the land of infidels and saw cities and mansions. I explored the realm of Islam and saw total ruins. In another famous poem, he criticizes those who blame Islam for Muslims' lack of progress. Islam, they say, is a stumbling block to the progress of the state. This story was not known before, and now it is the fashion. The young Ottomans hoped to establish a constitutional monarchy. Abdul Hamid II, Art 1876–1909, became sultan with their support, which he won by promising to share power with a parliament. The first Ottoman constitution was promulgated in 1876, a year later the Ottoman parliament was inaugurated. Parliament had two branches, the Chamber of Deputies, consisting of elected representatives, and the Chamber of Notables, consisting of the Sultan's appointees. In the first session, the Chamber of Deputies included 119 representatives, 71 Muslims, 44 Christians, and 4 Jews. The Chamber of Notables also reflected religious diversity. Thus, the Ottoman Parliament became the first truly multi-religious parliament of a major country in the world. 1 year later, however, Abdul Hamid closed parliament and ruled as an absolute monarch for more than 3 decades. Abdul Hamid was suspicious of intellectuals, hence, he sent Namik Kemal into exile, where the latter died. It was also during Abdulhamid's rule that Samseddin Sami, the above-mentioned translator of the Quran, was put under house arrest until his death, probably due to his political associations. Under this oppressive regime, many Ottoman intellectuals moved to Paris, where they organized opposition to the Sultan. Beyond Istanbul and Cairo, Muslim reformers emerged in other parts of the Muslim world too. In India, Syed Ahmad Khan, 1817–98, promoted a rationalist interpretation of Islam compatible with modern sciences. His major legacy is Aligarh Muslim University. Jamal al-Din al-Afghani, 1838–97, also defended Muslims' adoption of rationalism and modern sciences. To spread his ideas, Afghani traveled through Afghanistan, Iran, India, Egypt, France, and the Ottoman Empire. Despite their shared emphasis on modern sciences, there was a major disagreement between Ahmad Khan and Afghani. Ahmad Khan sought friendly relations with the British and focused his efforts on improving Indian Muslim education. Afghani, however, was a pan-Islamist who advocated Muslim political unity against Western colonialism. Among those who were inspired by Afghani, the most famous one was Islamic scholar and reformer Muhammad Abduh, 1849–1905. Abduh served on the administrative board of Al-Azhar and proposed to reform aspects of that institution in line with Western universities, as well as incorporating Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah and works of rationalist Mu'tazili theologians into its curriculum. Like Ahmad Khan, Ismail Gasparali, 1851–1914, lived under a colonial regime, in this case Russian rule in Crimea. He published a newspaper, Turkmen, with the goal of disseminating a common language for Turkic peoples. Trying to maintain good relations with the Russian rulers, Gasparali concentrated on modernizing education for Turkic youth while avoiding an anti-Russian discourse. He encouraged Muslim reformism and developed a new, jadid, method of primary school instruction. His ideas and teaching methods inspired a movement, Jadidism, which was very influential in Azerbaijan and Central Asia until its destruction under Stalin. Yusuf Akura, 1876–1935, was a prominent intellectual who was influenced by Gasparali. Similar to that of Afghani, the biography of Akura reflects the increasing interconnectedness of Muslim intellectuals across the world in the late 19th century. Akira was born in a city in Russia, grew up in Istanbul, went to exile and was educated in Paris, wrote his famous essay Three Types of Policy in Kazan, again in Russia, and had it published in Cairo in 1904. In the essay, Akira explained the problems of Ottomanism, pursued by Tanzimat bureaucrats, and Pan-Islamism, partially pursued by Abdul Hamid. Contra these policies, he proposed Pan-Turkism as an alternative policy for the Ottoman Empire. Akira's Turkish nationalism gained importance after the Young Turk Revolution in 1908. The Young Turks included both intellectuals and military officers. Unlike the Young Ottomans with their Ottoman patriotism and Islamic constitutionalism, the Young Turks emphasized Turkish nationalism and secularism. One famously secularist Young Turk was Abdullah Cevdet, 1869–1932, who translated and popularized European works of materialist philosophy. Cevdet declared that religion is the science of the masses, whereas science is the religion of the elite. In terms of Turkish nationalism, the leading ideologue of the Young Turks was Ziya Gökalp, 1876–1924. Influenced by the sociology of Emil Durkheim, Gökalp stressed the importance of national culture in holding Turkish society together. He argued for the compatibility of Turkish culture, Islam, as a religion, and Western civilization. Nationalist and secularist ideas of late Ottoman intellectuals influenced the founders of the Turkish Republic, declared in 1923. Its first president, Mustafa Kemal, later Ataturk, appointed Akira as the president of Turkish History Association. Nonetheless, Mustafa Kemal was much more radical than Akira and especially Gökalp in his opposition to the public role of Islam in the modern Turkish state. His assertive secularist views were closer to those of Cevdet. To sum up, in the 19th century, Muslim lands experienced state-led westernization reforms and produced many Western-educated intellectuals. The traditional Ulamat-state alliance weakened and in some cases disintegrated altogether. The reforms achieved some progress in the Ottoman Empire and Egypt, in terms of modernization of the military, the taxation system, medical conditions, and schooling. In colonized India and Russia, Muslim intellectuals also contributed to the education system of their communities. In particular, Ottoman reformists and intellectuals established a foundation for Turkish political mobilization during the Independence War, 1919–22, against Greek, French, Italian, and British occupiers. This mobilization and the war were led initially by some representative congresses and eventually by the Turkish parliament. Yet reformist and intellectual efforts during the 19th century ultimately failed to help Muslims catch up with the West. Muslims in Turkey, Egypt and other Arab countries, Iran, India, and Russia entered the 20th century with accumulated problems of political oppression and socio-economic backwardness. 19th century Muslim reformism proved ineffective for 5 reasons, enumerated below. First, although the ulama were largely sidelined and an independent intellectual class emerged, Muslims' class-based problems mostly persisted. Rulers and their bureaucrats filled the vacuum left by the ulama. The Ottoman Sultan Mahmud, Egypt's Mehmed Ali, and most of their successors were absolutist rulers who did not accept sharing power with other institutions or classes. Their westernization reforms were by and large top-down projects that did not accommodate the concerns or interests of intellectuals or merchants. There were 2 major attempts to turn the Ottoman political system into a constitutional monarchy, both of which failed. In 1878, Abdul Hamid, who could be defined as an Islamist, suspended parliament for good. In 1908, secularist Young Turks revolted and forced Abdul Hamid to reopen parliament. However, the Committee of Union and Progress, KUP, the party of the Young Turks, eventually established an authoritarian regime. The KUP regime was led by the 3 pashas and continued until the end of World War I. Hence, Ottoman westernization failed to produce a parliamentary and participatory political system. Second, authoritarian Muslim rulers controlled the economy without sufficiently encouraging the accumulation of private capital or the rise of a native bourgeoisie. In the Ottoman Empire, certain legal reforms promised to protect private property, the Tanzimat Edict of 1839, and were designed to uphold private ownership of lands, the Land Law of 1858, but in practice the state violation of private property and control over lands largely continued. A bourgeois class flourished, but it was almost exclusively a product of European powers' support for non-Muslim merchants. According to one analysis, in 1912, although non-Muslims, including Greeks and Armenians, constituted only 19% of the Ottoman population, they comprised between 66 and 85% of major local traders. This proportion was a result of the Ottoman state's centuries-old neglect of Muslim merchants, as well as its semi-colonized status at that time. Many Christian merchants among the Ottoman citizens turned into European protégés by becoming dual citizens of a European state. While these protégés were safeguarded against the arbitrariness of the Ottoman state policies, other Ottoman citizens remained vulnerable to state violations of their property. The protégés also paid lower taxes than regular citizens and were tried in consular courts instead of Ottoman ones. Consequently, the Ottoman bureaucracy regarded the bourgeoisie, which consisted mostly of protégés, as more European than native. This quasi-foreign identity mitigated the influence this bourgeoisie could exert on Ottoman politics. Said Halim Pasha was one of the Muslim intellectuals who was aware of this problem. He was the grandson of Egypt's Mehmed Ali, a leading young Turk, and Ottoman Grand Vizier, 1913–16. In his book Our Crises, said Halim Pasha lamented that in the Ottoman Empire, it was state servants rather than the aristocracy or the bourgeoisie that were the dominant class. For him, the state servants were inherently docile, obedient, and risk-averse. They were afraid of taking initiative and responsibility. In Western Europe, by contrast, the aristocratic and bourgeois classes had independence and courage, necessary qualities to become entrepreneurial. Third, the Ottoman education reform was unapologetically elitist. As late as 1910–12, an Ottoman minister of education defined the policy as similar to the tuba tree. Tuba was perceived to be an otherworldly tree, whose roots were at the top and branches at the bottom. The minister implied that instead of prioritizing the roots, mass education in primary schools, they prioritized the branches, elite education in high schools and colleges. In fact, this metaphor conveyed the general nature of Ottoman education reforms. Ottoman policymakers largely supported this prioritization based on their belief that the empire urgently needed a bureaucratic elite to respond to the crises of the times. This policy undermined the elementary education of society at large. The Ottoman education reform, therefore, was very different from the Japanese education reform, which began in 1868 with the Meiji Restoration and attached importance to mass elementary education. By 1908, Japan had made 6 years of schooling free and compulsory, and had over 90% of eligible students enrolled in schools. Fourth, efforts at westernization encountered political and religious resistance. In the Ottoman Empire, political resistance to westernization was strongest under the rule of Abdülhamid, who pursued a policy of Islamic modernization. On the one hand, Abdülhamid attacked intellectuals, rejected their demand for parliamentarianism, and promoted certain ulama and Sufi sheikhs to use Islam and his title caliph as a source of legitimacy in domestic and international politics. On the other hand, he opened many modern schools and established railroads. The main source of religious resistance was naturally the ulama. In the Ottoman Empire, the ulama were still part of the government in the late 19th century and had veto power on certain issues, such as the publication of the Turkish translation of the Quran. In Egypt, the ulama rejected Abdullah's proposals to reform Al-Azhar. In Central Asia and other Muslim lands under Russian rule, the ulama resisted the reform project of the Jihadists. There was also popular resistance to educational reforms. According to Selçuk Sumel, the Ottoman public primary schools were often not accepted by the Muslim population, whereas the traditional Quran schools, with the religious hoca as schoolmaster, continued to be respected by the people. This popular resistance might have further encouraged the Ottoman policymakers to prioritize elitist secular schools, rather than wrangling with the conservative masses over disagreements regarding primary education. Fifth and finally, European colonization was a major impediment to the success of Muslims' reforms. Muslims in India and Russia were already under colonial rule, and Egypt gradually turned into a British colony in the late 19th century. Colonization restricted Muslims' freedom to flourish and engendered reactionary anti-Western ideologies among them. The Ottoman Empire increasingly lost its economic independence in the face of European encroachment. The empire was collapsing under the pressure of Russian, French, British, and Italian occupations, as well as the secession and attacks by Balkan nations. Conclusion. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Western Europe and North America experienced important transformations such as the Enlightenment, the American and French Revolutions, and the Industrial Revolution. The Muslim world, however, remained mostly stagnant in the 18th century. Muslim countries even failed to effectively use printing technologies until the 19th century Westernization reforms. While Western European societies read millions of copies of Bible translations from the 15th century onward, printing a complete translation of the Quran remained taboo in Muslim societies until the 20th century. With their intellectual and socio-economic dynamism, Western countries developed their military technologies and organizations, and dominated the rest of the world. Only Russia and Japan caught up with Western levels of technological advance and organizational effectiveness, and both became colonial powers. In a nutshell, this is how European powers, particularly Britain, France, and Russia, used their military, political, and technological advances to colonize most of the Muslim world. Certain rulers in the Ottoman Empire and Egypt acknowledged this problem and undertook Westernization reforms in the 19th century. These reforms, as well as colonial rule, also led to the emergence of new, reformist intellectuals in various Muslim lands. Amid these developments, the traditional alliance between the ulama and the state weakened, even in those Muslim countries that maintained a certain level of independence from colonial powers, such as the Ottoman Empire and early 19th century Egypt. On the one hand, state-led reforms and intellectual movements contributed to Muslims' development of their bureaucracies and educational and medical institutions. On the other hand, these reforms and movements did not succeed in bringing Muslim societies to Western levels of political and socio-economic development. Authoritarian rulers established absolutist regimes and consolidated state monopolies over the economy in the Ottoman Empire and Egypt. The lack of a native bourgeoisie prevented economic creativity and innovation. The Ottoman Empire took pioneering steps by opening a parliament twice, but it failed to establish a truly representative political system. Opposition from Islamist rulers and the ulama, as well as European powers' direct and indirect colonization, also hindered the success of political and socio-economic reforms in the Muslim world. Among Muslim countries, the Ottoman Empire can be evaluated as the most likely case for successful Westernization. The Ottomans were geographically in the most western part of the Muslim world. They inherited the capital city and a certain imperial legacy from the Byzantine Empire. Eastern European Christians constituted a large percentage of their population for a long time. Their bureaucratic elite included many formerly Christian converts. Together with Egypt's Mehmed Ali, who was also originally an Ottoman officer, the Ottoman Empire undertook Westernization reforms before any other Muslim country, and even before Japan and China. Thus, if Westernization reforms could not succeed in this most likely case, they were unlikely to succeed in another Muslim country. That is why the Ottoman experiment is crucial in the analysis of Westernization reforms in the Muslim world. Despite the ulama's diminishing position in the Ottoman state, Ottoman Muslims largely continued to imagine the state and religion as twins and to jointly revere them. According to Martin, even the young Ottomans, who were much more westernized than the Muslim masses, were still heirs to a historically constructed dual devotion to Islam and the state. This devotion was reflected in the extremely common saying, Allah din u devleet zevel vermissen, may God protect religion and the state. This communitarian and statist worldview continued to be a major factor in the absence of creative philosophers, explorers, innovators, and entrepreneurs in the Ottoman Empire. Although the ulama-state alliance was weakened by the abolishment of the Janissaries and institutional Westernization reforms, this alliance's cultural legacy endured for two main reasons. First, Ottoman intellectuals, including the secularists, remained mostly communitarian and statist and tended not to support individualism. Second, as already elaborated, in terms of intellectual debates and educational institutions, the Ottoman reforms were largely an elitist project, which had limited influence among the Muslim masses. In sum, in the 19th century, the Muslim world inherited multiple intellectual, socio-economic, and political problems from earlier centuries, as I elaborated in Part 2. Despite efforts of reformist rulers and intellectuals, the Muslim world failed to solve most of these problems, which, as I explored in Part 1, persisted into the 20th century and continue to shape Muslim countries today. Conclusion. Comparative historical development. In part 2 of this book I analyze transformations in crucial periods of Muslim history in comparison to Western European history. This analysis has refuted the essentialist view that presents Muslim and Western cases as dichotomous, if not antagonistic, entities. This view not only misses the historical complexity of both cases but also reproduces stereotypes about them. Indeed, the Muslim and Western cases have had many similarities. The current differences between the two cases that seemingly justify the conventional comparative judgments between them are the result of complex historical processes and even reversals. In terms of class relations, from the 8th to the 11th century, Muslim societies had characteristics similar to what Western European societies would gain during the Renaissance: creative intellectuals and influential merchants. During this period, most Islamic scholars avoided serving the state. They were funded by trade revenue and regarded interactions with the rulers as corrupting. This arrangement began to change in the 11th century Seljuk Empire, which formed an ulama-state alliance. This formation was based on two main transformations. First, the military class came to dominate the economy and undermine merchants. Through the expansion of the Iqta system, the land revenues were distributed to military and other officials. Second, with the establishment of Nizamiya madrasas, the Sunni orthodoxy was consolidated and entrenched, while Islamic scholars increasingly became state servants. This ideological and institutional transformation gradually eliminated philosophers and independent Islamic scholars. Later, foreign attacks from Western Europe, Crusaders, and Inner Asia, Mongols, led many Muslims to seek refuge in the leadership of military and religious elites. Eventually, the Seljuk model of ulama-state alliance was adapted and adopted by subsequent Muslim empires, especially the Ayyubids/Mamluks, Ottomans, Safavids, and Mughals. Hence, the class relations that became dominant in the Muslim world during and after the 11th century resembled those in the early medieval Europe. Clerical and military elites dominated society and inhibited the flourishing of intellectuals and merchants. Western Europe also began to experience a multidimensional and gradual transformation in the 11th century, particularly on three issues. First, the separation between the Catholic Church and royal authorities was institutionalized, as neither side had proved capable of completely subduing the other. Second, class relations began to change, with merchants becoming increasingly influential. Third, universities started to be established, which would maintain an institutional basis for the flowering of intellectuals. New class relations ultimately became a source of economic and intellectual achievements during the Renaissance and in subsequent eras. Changing class relations had important consequences for Muslims and Western Europeans' comparative levels of scholarly, economic, and military development. Notwithstanding the risk of overgeneralizing and well aware of the criticisms on the horizon, I have summarized in Table C.1 my general understanding of the comparative historical development between Muslim and Western European societies. I have designed the table with an eye toward preventing certain misunderstandings regarding my analysis. For example, while I argue that Muslim scholarly advances became slower after the 11th century, I do not mean that Western Europe immediately exceeded Muslims on this front. As the table indicates, it was only in much later centuries that Western Europeans clearly surpassed Muslims in philosophy and the natural sciences. Violence, authoritarianism, and underdevelopment. In part 1 of this book, I examined the low levels of political and socio-economic development in most Muslim-majority countries in comparison to world averages. Especially in comparison to Western countries, levels of development in Muslim countries are undeniably low today. I critically evaluated arguments pointing to either Western colonialism or Islam as the main cause of these problems in the Muslim world. I argued instead that the ulama-state alliance has been the main cause of Muslims' problems. This alliance continued for centuries and left a legacy of authoritarianism and socio-economic underdevelopment in the 20th century Muslim world. Starting with Turkey's Ataturk in the 1920s, several secularist leaders either weakened or abolished the ulama-state alliance while establishing newly independent Muslim-majority states. Nonetheless, Muslim masses largely remained loyal to conservative ideas supporting a strong public role for the ulama. In a broader sense, three groups that I collectively call Islamic actors, the ulama, Islamists, and Sufi sheikhs, have received substantial popular support even in countries where top-down secularization policies were implemented for decades, including Turkey and Tunisia. The repeated failures of secularist politicians in foreign policy, the economy, and social reforms contributed to this popularity. Moreover, many secularist leaders reproduce certain aspects of the historical ulama-state alliance while trying to legitimize their rules by using Islamic institutions, such as Turkey's Diyanet and Egypt's Al-Azhar. Finally, in several Muslim countries, the ulama-state alliance either has continued to exist, such as in Saudi Arabia, or been revived in a different form, such as in Iran. My analysis particularly focused on three contemporary problems: violence, authoritarianism, and underdevelopment, which have constituted a vicious circle in the Muslim world. Although each of the three has its own causes, they are all interrelated. Regarding the problem of violence, there is no Muslim exceptionalism. Violence has occurred in all parts of the world. The frequent Muslim terrorist activities are a relatively recent trend that began in the 1980s. This trend is related to the worldwide decline of socialism and the rise of religious political movements. Until the 1980s, the most visible actors engaging violence were socialist groups. Even in the Middle East, later, Islamist groups replaced socialists in engaging in terrorism. Muslim countries have also had a large number of interstate and civil wars. These military conflicts and terrorism have multiple causes, including the colonial legacy, poverty, and authoritarian states, in particular. Assessing the relationship between Islam and violence, in Chapter 1, I emphasized 2 points. First, we should examine various interpretations of Islam rather than analyzing Islam as a single, monolithic entity. A particular interpretation of Islam, jihadi Salafism, has promoted violence primarily because it is based on the idea that one single Quranic verse, about attacking polytheists in Mecca, abrogated more than 100 other verses upholding peace, patience, toleration, and freedom of conscience. Second, although jihadi Salafis have been numerically marginal, their message has spread widely, because neither the ulama nor other Muslims have successfully promoted peace-promoting ideas as alternatives. The ulama did not effectively produce original alternatives, given their training, which prioritizes defending the tradition rather than reforming it. Other Muslims have also been unable to produce counterarguments to produce peace because the ulama have monopolized the production of legitimate Islamic discourses. Muslim intellectuals with no training in madrasas or their equivalents would have very limited legitimacy in the eyes of the Muslim community at large if they attempted to produce alternative interpretations of Islam. Political leaders have obviously had the lion's share of responsibility for violence in the Muslim world. It is they who declare wars against other states, and their authoritarian policies at home lead some groups to take up arms against them. Moreover, their authoritarian concern to retain power at any cost has made many Muslim countries inward-looking and security-obsessed. Electoral democracies constitute more than half of all countries in the world but less than 1/5 of the 49 Muslim-majority countries. Like violence, authoritarianism is a multifaceted problem with multiple ideological and economic causes. In the Muslim world, both Islamic and secularist actors have contributed to it. Close cooperation between the ulama and the state has secured a religious monopoly for the former and generated religious legitimacy for the latter. The ulama have hindered alternative interpretations of Islam, while the state has used religion to justify its crackdowns on political opponents. Other Islamic actors have also had problematic relations with democratic principles. The Islamists aim to impose a set of religious laws over the state and society. Where they have taken power or emerged as an influential opposition, the Islamists have generally led states to be more authoritarian. The Sufi sheikhs have largely promoted spiritual and even social hierarchy, thus, their ideas and orders have contributed to authoritarianism. The secularists also have embraced and promoted various non-democratic ideologies in many Muslim countries. Additionally, authoritarianism in the Muslim world has had a strong material basis. As a geological reality, Muslim countries have possessed 60% of the world's oil reserves. I elaborated in Chapter 2 how oil, gas, and other sources of rents have prolonged the dominance of non-productive political and religious elites in most Muslim countries. These rents have enabled the survival of many Islamist regimes, which are dominated by the ulama, such as Iran, or by an ulama monarchy alliance, such as Saudi Arabia. In some other Muslim cases, the absence of oil revenues forced political authorities to reduce state control over the economy and society. But these politicians have generally continued to seek rents and ways of going back to statist socio-economic policies. Even in Turkey, without oil rents and with European Union candidacy, Erdogan has built a semi-rentier system by receiving international loans and selling Istanbul's lands in order to finance his statist and authoritarian regime based on a new form of ulama-state alliance. Authoritarianism and rentierism have also been associated with the long-lasting socio-economic underdevelopment in the Muslim world. The overwhelming majority of Muslim countries gained independence after 1940, having already suffered for centuries with problems of low literacy rates, ineffective school and college systems, an absence of competitive corporations, inadequate transportation and communication infrastructure, and technological handicaps. Muslim countries needed creative intellectuals and a productive bourgeoisie to address these problems. Yet the marginalized status of the intellectuals and bourgeoisie has persisted in Muslim societies during the 20th century and onward. The following section summarizes my explanation of this persistence. No intelligentsia/bourgeoisie, no development. Muslim intellectuals and bourgeoisie have had limited influence in contemporary Muslim societies due to the limitations the ulama-state alliance has continued to put on them. Historically, the ulama declared some eminent philosophers and their followers as apostates to be killed. Contemporary ulama have not seriously grappled with this record and have left the issue of apostasy in Islamic law books unreformed, continuing to view apostasy as a punishable offense. Most ulama have not been directly responsible for the assassinations and executions of various intellectuals in such countries as Egypt and Sudan, but they have failed to challenge the ideological basis of these acts. Moreover, the ulama have defended an inflexible epistemology, discouraging new ideas and delegitimizing Muslim intellectuals' efforts at reinterpreting Islam. The ulama's epistemology relies on the Quran, hadiths, consensus of the ulama, and analogical reasoning. As I have elaborated, although this formula of 4 hierarchical sources was initially constructed by Shafi'i as a jurisprudential methodology, its influence was later expanded by Ghazali and other leading ulama, particularly during and after the 11th century, to the extent that it dominated theology and Sufism, and ultimately ordered even general Muslim knowledge. In this literalist epistemological hierarchy, reason is the least important source of knowledge and is confined to drawing analogies based solely on the 3 other, and superior, sources. Early Muslims generally used the concepts of reasoning and consensus in much more emancipatory and egalitarian ways. Abu Hanifa stressed a jurist's reason-based decision as a key criterion for jurisprudential authority. Consensus was also understood as a broad concept referring to the agreement of the Muslim community at large. Later, however, the ulama restricted reasoning writ large to mere analogical reasoning and consensus of the entire community to the consensus of the ulama. The powerful ulama have defended this hierarchical and exclusionary epistemology. They have undermined some exceptional ulama's attempts to make it more flexible by adding new criteria, such as the higher objectives of Islamic law. Despite their criticisms of the ulama, the Islamists have embraced the ulama's epistemology and thus acknowledged their authority to produce Islamic law. Similarly, although the Sufi sheikhs have had an additional criterion in their epistemology, so-called mystical knowledge, or they have largely accepted the epistemology and authority of the ulama. In sum, this epistemology, which has sidelined reason and disregarded empirical experience, has constituted a basis for the shared anti-intellectualism of the ulama, Islamists, and Sufi sheikhs. One might assume that the secularists would support intellectuals given their own 2-century-long struggle against Islamic actors, but this is not always the case. In most Muslim countries, secularist leaders have been authoritarian, statist, and nationalist, not champions of intellectual freedom and exploration. These leaders and their parties have generally been opposed to individualism, critical thinking, and diversity, unnecessary conditions for the flourishing of intellectual life. In many Muslim countries, secularists established a cult of personality around their leader, which resembled Sufis' glorification of their sheikh as a perfect man or the Mahdi. The secularists sidelined the ulama and allowed bureaucrats to occupy the vacuum where the ulama once held power. In this regard, political secularization strengthened bureaucrats but did not substantially improve the status of the intellectuals or bourgeoisie. In many Muslim countries, industrialists and businesspeople did emerge, but they have been too embedded within the state to constitute an independent bourgeoisie. Both the Islamic actors and secularists are responsible for the enduring weakness of the bourgeoisie. With few exceptions, the ulama have cooperated with and been co-opted by officials rather than allying with the bourgeoisie. The Islamists have aimed to capture state power and to redesign society in a top-down manner. Their totalitarian project leaves no room for an independent bourgeoisie. Likewise, the preaching of Sufi sheikhs has been too concerned with mysticism to promote a bourgeois work ethic. At the same time, secularist politicians have generally pursued statist economic policies, or at least a mixed economy combining a free market with state intervention. They have regarded an independent bourgeois class as a potential threat to their power. Many secularist leaders in such cases as Turkey, Iran, Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Algeria, Tunisia, Pakistan, and Indonesia had military backgrounds, which made it unlikely for them to truly appreciate the importance of the bourgeoisie for the economic and political development of their countries. In some, lacking strong intellectual and bourgeois classes, 20th-century Muslim countries were rarely able to solve the political and socio-economic problems they inherited. Recommendations. Throughout the 20th century and onward, several Islamic actors and secularists have tried to solve the aforementioned problems in the Muslim world. Islamic actors have attributed these problems to Western colonialism and imperialism. Although the secularists have primarily blamed Islamic actors for these problems, they have also criticized the West. Both of these antagonistic groups have proposed state-centric political solutions, therefore, both have tried to capture the state completely and eliminate the other side. I do not deny that Western colonialism and imperialism have destroyed local institutions and exploited natural resources in many Muslim countries. Nonetheless, focusing on the damage wrought by Western powers has distracted Muslims from addressing their own failures and reforming their ideas, policies, and institutions. Neither anti-Westernism nor the tug-of-war between Islamic actors and secularists will help Muslims solve their problems. Instead, both Islamic actors and secularists ought to address the problems of anti-intellectualism and state control over the economy. Islam is not responsible for Muslims' problems, but certain quasi-Islamic theories are. Throughout this book I have demonstrated that the theory and practice of the ulama-state alliance, which was inspired by the Sasanian notion of religion-state brotherhood, has been a source of Muslims' multiple crises. Today Muslims need new perspectives on politics and government. The secularists in the 20th century, and their reformist predecessors in the 19th century, accepted this necessity, though they have not been successful in producing philosophically deep and publicly convincing alternative political theories. The Islamic actors, by contrast, have largely continued to expect solutions from political theories written in the High and Late Middle Ages, 1000 to 1500, by perceiving them as based on Islam's sacred and timeless principles. However, this view is historically inaccurate. High and late medieval Islamic political thought and the theory of the caliphate in particular were heavily influenced by the Sasanian tradition of governance as well as specific political conditions, particularly those of the 11th century. I have analyzed the views of Mawardi, Ghazali, and Ibn Taymiyyah, authors of the most influential treatises on the theory of the caliphate and Sharia politics. Mawardi's ideal system rested on the rule by one man, the caliph, who holds executive, legislative, and judicial powers and then delegates his powers to viziers, governors, and judges. Since this ideal was not practical even in the 11th century, Mawardi and Ghazali discussed the coexistence of the caliph with the sultans. More than 2 centuries later, Ibn Taymiyyah made further compromises from the ideal one-man rule by prescribing joint governance by the rulers and the ulama. These caliphate theories include no discussion of the perils of one-man rule, of mechanisms for holding rulers accountable, or possibilities of legitimate opposition. These unapologetically authoritarian and patriarchal theories are worth our attention only as historical texts and should not inform Muslims' political thought in the 21st century. Defending these political theories keeps Islamic actors out of step with present realities and heightens secularists' anxieties about Islamic activism. My historical analysis may seem deterministic and pessimistic, in fact, it is neither. By explaining the ulama-state alliance as an 11th century construction, my analysis has indicated the possibility of change and the reasonableness of optimism. It has exposed the historical inaccuracy of seeing the ulama-state alliance as something essential to Islamic texts or permanent in Islamic history. Contemporary perceptions of Islam as a religion that necessarily rejects religion-state separation are mistaken. Hence, Muslims can redesign the relationship between their religion and their states in a way that would promote intellectual and economic creativity. Moreover, my analysis has shown that there is a historical basis for such a reform. From the 8th to the 10th century, Islamic scholars were mostly funded by commerce and largely avoided serving the state. During this period, Muslim societies produced cutting-edge polymaths and influential merchants. Critically analyzing Muslim history may contribute to the construction of a new, democratic, and progressive relationship between Islam and the state today. In order to solve the problems of violence, authoritarianism, and underdevelopment, as well as catch up to Western levels of development, Muslims should establish competitive and meritocratic systems. These will require substantial socio-economic and political reform with ideological and institutional dimensions. For such a reform to take place, Muslims need creative intellectuals and an independent bourgeoisie, who can balance the power of the ulama and state authorities.